He begged me to open the door, but by then it was already too late. The rain hadn't stopped for hours that night, the kind of cold, steady downpour that soaked through everything and made the world feel smaller, quieter, almost suffocating. And yet somehow it wasn't the storm that stayed with me. It was the silence after the door slammed shut behind me. The way Daniel didn't even hesitate, didn't even look back, just stood there with that hardened expression like I was a stranger standing in his living room instead of the woman who had shared his life for 5 years. And I remember gripping my coat tighter. Not because it was cold, but because something inside me had just shifted in a way I couldn't undo. Something final, something irreversible. And the strangest part wasn't the anger or the shock. It was the calm, the eerie, quiet understanding settling in my chest as I stepped off that porch and into the rain. Because in that moment I realized something Daniel didn't, something he couldn't see through his certainty and pride. And that was the fact that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life, but of course he didn't know that yet. Not when he turned off the porch light and left me standing there. Not when he convinced himself he was right. And definitely not when he went back inside thinking the story had ended, because for him it was over, simple, clean, justified, but for me that was only the beginning. And if you had seen us just weeks before, you never would have guessed it would end like this. We were the kind of couple people pointed to, stable, successful, the kind who hosted dinners on weekends and remembered birthdays and talked about future plans like they were already written in stone. And Daniel, he liked things that way, predictable, controlled, neat. He believed in facts, in proof, in making decisions quickly and standing by them. And maybe that was part of the problem, because when doubt crept in, when something didn't fit into his version of the truth, he didn't question it, he replaced it, filled in the gaps with assumptions that felt easier to accept. And I could see it happening long before that night, the subtle distance, the way his questions started sounding less like curiosity and more like quiet accusations, the way he'd pause just a second too long before responding, like he was measuring my words against something I didn't even know existed. And still I stayed quiet, not because I didn't have answers, but because I knew something he didn't, something that made every argument pointless, something that made that final moment almost inevitable. And even now, standing on the other side of it, hearing him knock on my door weeks later with a voice I barely recognized, desperate, regretful, asking for another chance, I didn't feel vindicated, I didn't feel angry, I just felt certain, because the truth he had forgotten, the one thing he should have held on to, had already changed everything. And by the time he finally understood it, I was already gone. If you had asked Daniel that night why he did it, he would have told you it was simple, that he had seen enough, heard enough, that the evidence spoke for itself and there was nothing left to discuss. And that was always his strength and his flaw at the same time, the way he trusted what was in front of him without ever asking what might be missing behind it. Because Daniel Bennett was not a man who liked uncertainty, he liked clean answers, clear lines, right and wrong, and in his mind I had crossed one of those lines in a way that could not be undone. And maybe that was why he did not hesitate when he told me to leave, why his voice did not shake, why he did not even give me the space to explain, because to him the story was already complete, already proven, already over. But what he did not realize was that the story he believed in had been carefully arranged piece by piece, until it looked so convincing that even someone like him could not see the cracks. And I remember the exact moment everything shifted, not that night but days before, when he came home earlier than usual, his expression unreadable, his movements too controlled, like he was holding something back. And when he asked me where I had been that afternoon, it was not a casual question, it was precise, timed, almost rehearsed, and I told him the truth, the same truth I had been living for weeks, but I could see it in his eyes that he was not hearing me anymore. He was comparing my words to something else, something he had already decided was more real. And that was the first time I understood that whatever was coming, it was not going to be a conversation, it was going to be a verdict. And still, I stayed calm, I answered every question, I did not raise my voice, I did not push back. Because there was something about the way he looked at me that told me he was waiting for me to slip, waiting for me to confirm what he already believed, and I refused to give him that, even when he mentioned the messages, even when he brought up the account activity, even when he described details that sounded so specific they almost felt impossible to deny. Because that was the brilliance of it. Whoever had set this in motion knew exactly how to build a narrative that would hold under pressure, a version of events that would feel undeniable, and Daniel, with his need for certainty, walked right into it. And by the time that final night arrived, by the time the rain started falling and the tension in the house had stretched so thin it felt like it could snap at any second, there was nothing left to say that would change his mind. He had already decided who I was, what I had done, and what needed to happen next. And as he stood there in the doorway telling me to leave, listing out the reasons like they were facts carved in stone, I realized something that made everything strangely clear. This was never about what I said or did. This was about what he believed, and belief, once it is locked in like that, is almost impossible to break. And that was why I did not argue, why I did not beg, why I did not even try to defend myself in that moment, because the truth, the real truth, was not something I could force him to see. It was something he would have to discover on his own. And when he finally did, when all the pieces fell into place and the version of reality he trusted so completely started to unravel, it would not just be a mistake he could fix with an apology, it would be something far heavier, something that would follow him long after that door closed behind me, long after he convinced himself he had done the right thing, because the one thing Daniel forgot, the one thing he underestimated, was that the truth does not disappear just because you choose not to see it. It waits quietly, patiently, until the moment it can no longer be ignored. The strange thing about that night was not the way Daniel raised his voice or the way the rain kept hitting the windows like it was trying to get inside. It was the way I felt almost detached from it all, like I was watching someone else's life unfold in front of me instead of standing there in my own living room. Because by then I already knew something he did not, and that knowledge changed everything about how I reacted, how I moved, even how I looked at him as he spoke. And I think that was what unsettled him the most, not anger, not denial, but the absence of both, because when someone expects a fight and you give them silence instead, it creates a kind of tension that is far more uncomfortable than any argument. And I could see it in the way his jaw tightened, in the way he repeated himself, as if saying the same thing louder would somehow force me to respond differently. But I did not, I just listened, letting him lay out every detail he believed in, every piece of evidence he thought proved his point, and the more he spoke, the clearer it became just how carefully constructed it all was, the timestamps, the transactions, the messages that seemed to connect perfectly, each one reinforcing the next until the entire story felt solid, unshakable. And if I had not known the truth, if I had not lived every moment behind those details, I might have believed it too. And that was the most unsettling part of all. Realizing how easy it is to build a lie that looks exactly like reality when you only show the right pieces. And Daniel, he was not careless, he was not foolish, he was simply certain, and certainty can blind you faster than anything else, because once you decide something is true, you stop looking for anything that might prove otherwise. And I could see that happening in real time as I stood there, the way he dismissed anything that did not fit, the way he focused only on what confirmed his belief. And in that moment I understood that nothing I said would matter. Not because I did not have answers, but because he was not asking questions anymore. He was delivering a conclusion. And when someone reaches that point, logic does not change their mind, only time does, and sometimes even that is not enough. And so when he finally paused, when the room fell quiet except for the rain and the faint hum of the refrigerator in the background, I made a choice that would define everything that came next. I chose not to tell him, not to reveal the one thing that would have shattered his entire narrative in seconds, not because I wanted him to suffer, but because I knew it would not matter in that moment, because even if I handed him the truth right then and there, he would find a way to question it, to doubt it, to twist it until it fit what he already believed. And that was not a battle I was willing to fight, not anymore. So instead I picked up my bag slowly, deliberately, letting the silence stretch just long enough for him to realize that I was not going to argue, not going to beg, not going to defend myself in the way he expected. And that was when something shifted in his expression. Just for a second, a flicker of uncertainty, like a small crack forming in something that had seemed completely solid. But it was not enough to stop him, not yet, because pride has a way of holding people in place even when doubt begins to creep in. And so he stepped aside, opened the door, and repeated the same words, telling me to leave, telling me there was nothing left to say. And as I walked past him, as I stepped out into the cold night air with the rain soaking through my coat and the streetlights casting long reflections across the pavement, I realized that this was not the end of something. It was the beginning of something far more complicated, because the truth he had forgotten was already moving toward him, already closing the distance. And when it finally reached him, when he saw what he had missed, it would not come gently, it would arrive all at once. Undeniable, impossible to ignore. And by then, the version of me he thought he could send away so easily would no longer be the same person standing on that porch. By the time the door closed behind me, the world felt quieter in a way that did not make sense, because nothing about that moment should have been calm, and yet every step I took down the driveway felt steady, measured, almost intentional, like I had already accepted something that Daniel had not even begun to understand. And I did not look back, not once, because I knew if I did, it would not change anything, not the decision he had made, not the version of me he believed in, and not the truth. That was already set in motion long before that night. And as I reached the end of the street, rain dripping from my sleeves and the cold settling deeper into my bones, I pulled out my phone, not to call him, not to explain, but to confirm something I had been tracking quietly for days, something that had started as a small inconsistency and slowly turned into a pattern too deliberate to ignore. And when I opened the app and saw the notification waiting exactly where I expected it to be, time stamped down to the minute, it told me everything I needed to know, because while Daniel had been building his certainty from what he thought were facts, someone else had been building something far more precise, something designed not just to convince him but to isolate me, to make sure that when the moment came I would stand alone with no easy way to defend myself. And the more I looked back on the past few weeks, the clearer it became. The misplaced messages, the unusual account activity, the way certain details only appeared when Daniel was around to notice them. It was not random, it was orchestrated. And the person behind it understood him well enough to know exactly how to shape his perception, how to guide him toward a conclusion he would believe was entirely his own. And that was what made it dangerous, not the lie itself, but the way it blended so seamlessly into reality that it became almost impossible to question. And I could have stopped it, maybe not completely, but enough to slow it down, enough to force him to pause and look closer. But that would have required trust, and by the time I realized what was happening, that trust was already slipping, already being replaced by doubt that grew stronger with every carefully placed piece of evidence. And so I chose a different path, one that did not rely on convincing him in the moment, but on letting the truth reveal itself in a way that could not be denied later. Because the one thing people like Daniel never expect is to be wrong in a way that is undeniable, in a way that leaves no room for interpretation. And as I stood there under the dim streetlight, watching cars pass by and feeling the weight of everything that had just happened settle into something solid and clear, I realized that this was not about proving myself anymore. It was about letting the truth reach him on its own terms, and when it did, it would not be something he could argue with or dismiss. It would be something he would have to face completely. And that was when everything would change, not just for him but for me as well, because the version of myself that had stood in that doorway waiting for him to listen was already gone, replaced by someone who understood that sometimes silence is not weakness, it is strategy, and sometimes walking away is not losing, it is the first step in taking back control. And as I finally stepped off the curb and waved down a car, giving the driver an address I had not planned to use that night but somehow felt inevitable now, I allowed myself one last thought about Daniel, not anger, not regret, but a quiet certainty that when he finally saw the truth, when he realized what had really happened and how easily he had been led to believe something that was never real, the hardest part would not be admitting he was wrong, it would be understanding that by the time he knew it, there would be nothing left for him to fix. The car ride across town felt longer than it actually was, not because of the distance but because of the silence, the kind that gives your thoughts too much space to move, to connect pieces you have been holding apart. And as the streetlights passed one by one outside the window, I started to see the pattern more clearly than ever before, not just what had happened, but how precisely it had been timed, how every detail had been placed just far enough apart to seem natural, but close enough together to build momentum. And the more I thought about it, the more one question kept coming back, not why Daniel believed it, but who needed him to, because this was never just about convincing him. It was about positioning me, isolating me at the exact moment when his trust would collapse completely, and that required more than coincidence. It required access, awareness, and patience, someone who understood both of us well enough to predict how we would react under pressure. And as I replayed the past month in my mind, certain moments stood out in a way they had not before, conversations that seemed harmless at the time but now felt carefully guided, suggestions that nudged Daniel's attention in specific directions, small comments that planted doubt without ever appearing direct. And then there were the technical details, the account alerts, the login locations that did not quite match, the messages that appeared at just the right time to be discovered, all of it forming a trail that looked accidental on the surface but revealed intent the moment you stepped back far enough to see the full picture. And I realized then that the person behind this had made one critical assumption, that once Daniel reached his conclusion, I would react the way most people do, that I would panic, defend myself, try to prove my innocence immediately, and in doing so, give them more opportunities to reinforce the narrative they had already built. But by walking away, by choosing silence instead of confrontation, I had disrupted that expectation. I had stepped outside the version of events they had prepared for, and that meant the timeline they were relying on was no longer guaranteed. And that was the first real shift in control, subtle but important because it created space, and space was exactly what I needed. And when the car finally slowed and pulled up in front of a modest building with a single light still on in one of the upstairs windows, I took a breath that felt different from all the ones before it, steadier, more grounded. And as I stepped out onto the sidewalk, the rain now reduced To a light drizzle that barely touched the surface of the street, I checked my phone again, not out of habit but out of confirmation, and there it was, another update, another small piece falling into place exactly where it should, reinforcing what I had already begun to understand, and this time instead of uncertainty I felt clarity because the pattern was no longer forming, it was established, and the person responsible was no longer hidden behind randomness, they were moving with intention, and intention always leaves a trail if you know how to look for it. And as I walked toward the entrance, toward the next step in something that had already grown far beyond a simple misunderstanding, I knew that Daniel was still sitting in that house, still convinced he had acted on truth, still unaware that the very certainty he trusted was the same thing that had been used against him, and the distance between what he believed and what was real was growing wider with every passing minute, and when those two things finally collided, when the illusion could no longer hold, the impact would not just change how he saw me, it would change how he saw everything, including the one person he never thought to question. The building I stepped into that night was not unfamiliar, but it had never felt as important as it did in that moment. The narrow hallway lit by a single overhead bulb, the faint hum of an old air conditioning unit somewhere in the back, and the quiet sense that everything about this place existed outside the version of my life Daniel thought he understood. And as I climbed the stairs, each step steady and deliberate, I could feel the distance between who I had been just hours ago and who I was becoming stretch further apart, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, irreversible shift that happens when you stop reacting and start seeing clearly. And when I reached the door at the end of the hallway and knocked twice, there was no hesitation on the other side, just a pause long enough to confirm identity before the lock clicked open, and when the door swung inward, I was met with a calm expression that told me everything I needed to know without a single word being spoken. Because this was not a surprise, this was expected, anticipated, prepared for, and as I stepped inside and the door closed behind me, shutting out the faint sounds of the street below, the world narrowed into something more focused, more precise, and for the first time since that night began, I was no longer alone in what I knew, and that changed the weight of everything, because knowledge held by one person can feel uncertain, but shared knowledge becomes something solid, something actionable. And as I placed my phone on the table and turned the screen toward the person standing across from me, the data was already there, organized, time-stamped, connected in ways that removed any doubt about what we were looking at, and it was no longer a question of whether something had been manipulated but how and by whom. And that was where things became even more unsettling, because the deeper we looked, the clearer it became that this was not impulsive. It was methodical, every action aligned with a larger objective that went beyond a simple misunderstanding or personal conflict, and that meant the person behind it was not just trying to create doubt, they were trying to control the outcome, to guide events toward a specific conclusion, and the most effective way to do that is not through force but through perception, through shaping what someone believes is true until they act on it without ever realizing they are being influenced. And Daniel, with his need for clarity and his confidence in his own judgment, had been the perfect target for that kind of approach, because once he believed something he committed to it completely, and that commitment had been used against him in a way he could not yet see. And as we traced the connections further, mapping out the sequence of events from the first irregularity to the moment everything escalated, a single pattern emerged that stood out from the rest, not because it was obvious, but because it was consistent, subtle shifts that all pointed back to the same source, the same access point, the same proximity to both of our lives. And that was when the situation changed from something confusing to something clear, not comfortable, not easy, but clear enough to understand the direction it was heading. And as I stood there, looking at the full picture laid out in front of me, I realized that whatever came next was no longer about reacting to what had already happened, it was about deciding what to do with what we now knew, because the truth was no longer hidden, it was forming, taking shape in a way that would eventually reach Daniel whether I chose to intervene or not. And the only question left was timing, because timing determines everything, not just when the truth is revealed but how it is received, and whether it has the power to change anything at all. And somewhere across town Daniel was still sitting in a house that now felt emptier than he expected, still replaying the same certainty in his mind, still unaware that the foundation of that certainty had already begun to crack. And when it finally broke, when everything he believed started to unravel piece by piece, the hardest part would not be facing what he got wrong, it would be understanding why he never saw it coming. What made everything even more unsettling was not just that we could see the pattern now, but that once you recognized it, you could not unsee it, every small detail from the past few weeks suddenly aligning into something that felt intentional in a way that was impossible to dismiss. And the more we followed that pattern, the narrower the possibilities became, because access like this did not come from a stranger. It came from someone close enough to observe without raising suspicion, someone who knew our routines, our habits, the way Daniel processed information, the way I responded under pressure. And as that realization settled in, it did not bring panic, it brought clarity, the kind that removes hesitation entirely. Because when the unknown becomes known, even if the answer is uncomfortable, it gives you direction, and direction was exactly what I needed now. And as we continued to go through the data, cross-referencing timestamps, locations, and the sequence of events that had led to that night, one thing became undeniable. There were moments when the manipulation had been too precise to be coincidental, actions taken within minutes of private conversations, details that could only have come from someone who had been present or had direct access to information that was never meant to leave those conversations. And that was when the last piece fell into place, not as a dramatic revelation, but as a quiet certainty that settled in. Without resistance, because deep down I think I had already suspected it, I just had not allowed myself to fully acknowledge it until now. And the weight of that realization was not in the surprise, but in the confirmation, because it meant that everything Daniel believed had not just been a misunderstanding, it had been guided, shaped by someone he trusted enough to never question, and that trust was the very thing that had been used to mislead him. And as I stood there looking at the final connections laid out clearly in front of me, I knew that the next step was not about gathering more proof, it was about deciding how to present what we already had in a way that could not be ignored or dismissed. Because if there was one thing I understood about Daniel, it was that he needed certainty, not suggestions, not possibilities, but something concrete enough to break through the narrative he had already committed to. And that meant timing it carefully, choosing the exact moment when the contrast between what he believed and what was real would be impossible for him to reconcile. And as we discussed the options, mapping out how that moment might unfold, I could not help but think about where he was right now, sitting alone in that house, surrounded by the silence he thought he wanted, replaying the same conclusions in his mind, reinforcing them with every passing minute, and maybe, just maybe, starting to notice the small inconsistencies that had not quite fit even then. The details he had overlooked in his rush to be certain, because doubt has a way of creeping in slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, until it reaches a point where it can no longer be ignored. And when that happens, the shift can be sudden, overwhelming, and impossible to reverse. And that was the moment I was waiting for, not because I wanted him to struggle, but because it was the only way he would truly see what had happened, not just on the surface but underneath it, where the real story had been unfolding the entire time. And as I finally stepped back from the table, the plan no longer abstract but fully formed, I felt something settle into place inside me, not relief, not satisfaction, but a steady certainty that whatever happened next would not be driven by reaction or emotion, it would be driven by truth. And when that truth reached Daniel, when it finally broke through everything he thought he knew, it would not just change how he saw me, it would force him to confront the one thing he had never questioned, the person standing closest to him all along. By the next morning, the rain had stopped completely, leaving behind a stillness that felt almost unnatural, as if the world itself was pausing before something inevitable unfolded. And across town, Daniel woke up in a house that no longer felt the same, not because anything had physically changed, but because silence has a way of amplifying what people try to ignore. And for the first time since that night, the certainty he had held onto so tightly began to feel less solid. Not enough to break, but enough to shift, and it started with something small, something almost insignificant, a detail that did not quite align the way he remembered, a timestamp that felt slightly off, a message that appeared too perfectly timed, and under normal circumstances, he would have dismissed it, brushed it aside as irrelevant, but without my presence there to absorb his attention, to ground the moment in something familiar. Those small inconsistencies had space to grow, to connect, to form questions he had not allowed himself to ask before. And once a question forms in a mind that values certainty, it does not disappear easily, it demands resolution, it pushes forward until it finds an answer. And Daniel, whether he realized it or not, had already taken the first step away from blind confidence and towards something far more uncomfortable, doubt. And doubt, once it reaches a certain point, changes everything, because it forces you to re-examine what you thought you already understood. And as he moved through the house that morning, going through routines that suddenly felt unfamiliar without me there, those questions followed him, subtle at first, then more persistent, until ignoring them required more effort than acknowledging them. And that was when he did something he had not done before. He went back, not to confirm what he already believed, but to check it, to verify it in a way that allowed for the possibility that something might be wrong, and that single shift in perspective was enough to start unraveling everything, because when he looked at the same information through a different lens, the details did not change, but the way they connected did. Patterns that once felt obvious now felt forced, timelines that once seemed precise now showed small gaps, and those gaps once noticed could not be unseen. And as he followed that thread further, pulling at each inconsistency one by one, the structure he had built his certainty on began to weaken, not collapsing all at once, but loosening just enough to let something else through, and that something was the realization that the story he believed might not be complete. And the moment that realization took hold, everything else began to shift with it, because if one part was wrong, then any part could be wrong. And that was when the weight of what he had done started to settle in, not fully, not yet, but enough to create a sense of unease he could not explain away. And it was in that moment, standing in a house that suddenly felt too quiet, too empty, that Daniel reached for his phone, not with the same certainty he had the night before, but with hesitation, with a question forming in his mind that he could no longer ignore. And somewhere else, far removed from that house and the silence that filled it, I was already aware of the shift that had begun, because the truth does not need to force its way in. It only needs the right moment to be seen, and that moment had finally arrived, setting into motion the final step that would bring everything into the open, not gradually, not subtly, but in a way that could no longer be denied or explained away. By the time Daniel stepped outside that morning, phone still in his hand and questions now impossible to ignore, the version of reality he had held onto the night before was already beginning to collapse under its own weight, not in a dramatic way, not all at once, but in a series of quiet realizations that connected faster than he could keep up with. And it was not one single piece of evidence that changed everything. It was the way they no longer aligned, the way he remembered, the way each detail he revisited seemed just slightly off, like a story that had been edited too carefully, too perfectly, until it no longer felt real when examined closely. And as he traced those inconsistencies further, going back through messages, checking timestamps again, comparing locations with a level of scrutiny he had not applied before, the pattern we had already seen began to reveal itself to him as well, slowly at first, then all at once. And when it finally clicked, when the connections became impossible to dismiss, the realization did not come with clarity or relief. It came with something far heavier, something that settled in his chest and refused to move, because the truth he was uncovering did not just challenge what he believed about me, it challenged what he believed about himself, about his judgment, about the one person he had trusted without question. And that was when everything shifted completely, because doubt turned into understanding, and understanding turned into regret, not the kind that fades with time, but the kind that arrives suddenly and stays, replaying moments over and over again with a new perspective that makes every decision feel heavier than it did before. And somewhere between that realization and the next breath he took, Daniel understood that he had not just made a mistake, he had been guided into making it, and the certainty he had relied on had never really been his own. And that was the moment he reached out, not with confidence, not with anger, but with something closer to desperation, calling my number, then calling again when it went unanswered, each attempt carrying more urgency than the last, until he finally stood outside a door he had never expected to stand in front of, the same door I had walked through the night before. And when he knocked, there was none of the authority he had carried just hours earlier, only hesitation, only the quiet hope that maybe things were not as final as they now seemed. But the truth about timing is that once it passes, it does not return. And when the door opened and he saw me standing there, calm, composed, no longer the version of me he had sent away, everything he had been holding on to broke in a way that could not be undone, because the truth was no longer something abstract or distant. It was right in front of him, complete, undeniable, supported by every detail he had once trusted and now understood differently. And in that moment, words did not carry the same weight they once did. Apologies, explanations, attempts to fix what had already been broken, they all felt smaller than the reality he was facing, because the one thing he could not change was the fact that when it mattered most, he had chosen belief over trust, certainty over understanding, and that choice had consequences that extended beyond a single night, beyond a single decision. And as he stood there trying to find something to say that could bridge the distance between what had been and what was now, I realized that the ending he was hoping for no longer existed, not because of anger, not because of resentment, but because something more fundamental had shifted, something that could not be reversed simply by recognizing it. And as I met his gaze, steady and clear, I understood that the truth had done exactly what it needed to do, not just revealing what had been hidden, but showing both of us exactly where we stood. And for Daniel, that meant facing a reality where the person he thought he could send away so easily was no longer someone he could ask to come back.